Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Time Extend. My name is Adam Ismail, as always, and I am joined today with
Brendan Rorison, and we've got another guest episode today, so it's not just going to be myself and Adam blaring down your ears. We also have with us Digital Foundry's finest, John Linneman. John, how's it going?
Hey, it's going pretty good, guys. I'm happy to be here. Talk some racing games, talk some racing tech, all that good stuff. You know I love this stuff.
I'm so happy to have you on, John. We're both big fans of your work, and personally, I knew as soon as I saw that there were Ridge Racer and Daytona USA episodes of Digital Foundry, I knew I wanted you on this show.
Oh yeah, love that stuff.
Yeah, so glad we could make it happen. And this is every episode of Time Extend is international by nature, of course, but this one really is. And I'm getting up at 4 a.m. to make it happen, so...
That is pure dedication.
Not to gloat or anything. But, yeah, so the topic for this episode is a little bit different than what we normally do. Normally we'll have, like, a certain series we'll want to talk about, or we'll have news that is relevant and worth talking about. This one is going to be centered on... racing games that were really kind of impressive tech showcases over the years. And, John, obviously this is a topic that you are very familiar with, and we thought would be fun to talk about. Especially in the context of older games, because it was just more of a phenomenon back then. When the new system would come out, usually among the slate of launch titles, there would almost always be a racing game, and that racing game would almost always be one of the earlier prime examples of really impressive tech on the system.
Yeah, it's a great way to showcase a new console, I think. And typically, generating enough content for a racing game is a little easier than some other genres for hitting launch. So it made a lot of sense to see these sort of like hardware pushing examples right away.
Yeah, and it's interesting comparing the stuff that appears obviously in the beginning of a system's lifespan with what appears at the end. And thinking about the beginning specifically, the first series that I thought really made sense to kind of bring up is obviously Ridge Racer, because it launched with so many platforms. Also, I mean, with the PS1 titles, it was around throughout kind of the lifespan of the system, but later on it was more of a launch thing. But it's funny because, like, trying to figure out, and I was saying this to both of you, trying to figure out where to start with Ridge Racer is almost difficult, because, like, it was there, it was so present all the time, Yeah. And there are so many examples of really impressive. Namco was almost always trying to push the boundaries of whatever hardware they were making games for, especially with the PS1, and Ridge Racer is such a perfect example of that.
Yeah, for sure. I also think, like, when you look at it across both the home consoles and portables, it's like Ridge Racer was just such a major factor, especially on PlayStation for quite some time. So, like you say, there's just so many titles that you could delve into.
Yeah, I would say the key titles here in terms of pushing hardware, it's the launch games for PlayStation 1, 2, 3, and the PSP. Because each of these games did some impressive things right away at launch. Like, obviously, Ridge Racer 1, right? The big thing there is that it was bringing home the arcade experience to the PlayStation. And it got close, as a launch game. Obviously, the frame rate was halved, the resolution was reduced, but it looked like the arcade game. It ran smoother than any other sort of home racing game at the time. Like, it was 30 frames per second. And that actually really gave it a leg up over the competition. I mean, obviously, there's the Sega Saturn with Daytona, which was 20 frames per second and, reduced detail all around. And I've always thought it's a little bit unfair in the sense that Ridge Racer in the arcade was sort of a somewhat lower spec game than Daytona USA. I mean, Daytona had the Model 2 hardware pushing it, a huge playfield of cars, like texture filtering, like it was super advanced. So there's no way you're bringing that home. So they did all right considering that. But Ridge Racer just had that advantage in that the PlayStation wasn't that different or that far off from that Ridge Racer arcade hardware. So you could actually get something that really looked and felt a lot like the arcade game.
Yeah, and for the time, I mean, pretty much just suffering a slight reduction in resolution and half the frame rate was still really good in terms of an arcade port, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. I mean, you think about it, like, this came out in 1994 in Japan. The original Ridge Racer did. You know, if you look at other console racing games, you know, on Super NES, what you have Stunt Race FX running at like 7 frames per second. Virtua Racing on the Mega Drive / Genesis would come along, and that's like 15. You know, Need for Speed on the 3DO would show up. It was a cool game, but the frame rate was absurdly low. You know, just home racing games didn't really run smoothly, specifically the 3D polygon racers. So to have one that was 30 frames per second was like, that was incredible.
Now, this will actually bring up a point that we often get criticized for here on Time Extend. And Brendan, I actually don't really know where you stand on this, but so my issue with Ridge Racer is that with the early games, I feel like they really didn't get the physics and the car handling down until 4. And for that reason, even though the original Ridge Racer is very impressive from a technical standpoint, and as you say, I mean, it had like 3 times the frame rate of Daytona USA, or not 3 times, sorry, but it had a much smoother
faster.
frame rate. Yeah, faster. Yeah. I was thinking of the arcade version there. I just can't get down with the handling. There's just something that feels really kind of lazy about the way the cars steer.
I know what you mean about this, actually, but there's a couple things. First of all, I'm doing something with these games soon, so I played a ton of these original Ridge Racer games again in the last couple weeks, and you totally can get back into it. I kind of feel like I finally had a good handle on the drifting system. It is challenging, and in some ways it feels like it's still tuned to be played. Like, I've always said Ridge Racer is one of the few racing games that works really well with the D-pad, and that's true, but at the same time, like the first games, like they feel like they really want a little bit of that arcade steering wheel kind of action for the best play. Because you kind of, the big problem I have, and you can master it, but it's when you come out of a drift, it feels sometimes like it's hard to like gain traction again, and so you smack into a wall basically. So mastering that is tough, but you can totally get it. And you're right, I would agree that they got more polished in time in terms of handling.
Yeah, I think like the original game, especially, it's very easy to kind of play the game wrongly as well and not be punished too much by it, in the sense that learning how to drift is obviously a core part of Ridge Racer and later kind of dictates where the series goes when it kind of cranks up to 11. But I feel as if even when like I was younger playing the original Ridge Racer, I would often be like going round corners at like hilariously slow pace and stuff, but still feel as if I was doing well and been able to overtake some cars. But it's not my go-to whenever I want to play some Ridge Racer, but I do feel as if maybe that's for one of the reasons I think you were saying there, John, just in the sense that because it's so kind of specific the way that the cars kind of drift in that game, and especially coming out of the drifts being really difficult, it's one of those ones where although there's kind of small content, there's a lot to master on the gameplay side of things, which I think is why you could spend a lot of time trying to learn how to play and get into that. But ultimately, you naturally train toward what you know, and I think that's why most people kind of trained towards kind of Ridge Racer onwards.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting point, and that's, you know, if the game was just like, pick up and you just immediately could master those drifts, like if it had like say Ridge Racer 6 and 7 style drifting, it would not work because the game has very little content. You just go and just immediately master it, and what makes it still appealing today, even with such little content, is just it is difficult to master, and the more you play, you do feel yourself getting better, and it feels very classic arcade in that sense. But you know, beyond the handling, beyond the visuals, you know, it was also just a simple, smooth kind of experience. You know, minimal loading times. You could swap in your own soundtrack CDs. Yeah. It introduced the Namco like mini game thing that they patented, which It's very, very common, that generation.
It's so funny. It's, when you're a kid and you're playing the game, you don't even really know what's going on. It's only later on did I learn, the whole time that I'm absolutely getting my, my butt kicked in Galaga, I'm actually loading the game so I can put in a CD or something or listen to a different soundtrack. Pretty funny.
Yeah. Now, I guess from here then, I think it's important then to note Ridge Racer High Spec.
Yeah.
Which was the bonus disc included with Ridge Racer Type 4. And I actually think this is a really interesting bonus because it was essentially Namco saying, look how much we've learned in these few short years. And it basically goes from the 320 by 240 at 30 frames per second of the original Ridge Racer to it's a 480i interlaced image, so at least double, maybe quadruple the res. I actually don't know the pixel count on that. And it runs at 60 frames per second. So it's basically high res mode, 60 FPS, much more like the arcade. And yeah, it's pretty absurd to see that running on the original PlayStation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know about high spec until I was a lot older. I didn't actually see the disc in action or hear about it in any magazines, so obviously once you kind of get into the rabbit hole of looking at these things, especially with Ridge Racer, this is one of the kind of stories I was like, oh man, it would have been incredible to see that firsthand when it first appeared. But even going back and visiting it, it just goes to show the importance of 60 frames per second, which of course applies to many racing games. But I often feel as if kind of smooth frame rates are automatically attributed to a more realistic kind of simulation experience. But when you see a great arcade racer running at those higher frame rates, it's just that it's totally transformative.
Oh, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I think from here we could talk about all the PlayStation Ridge Racers, but there's probably not time for that. So
yeah.
let's stick with the launch titles. So I think Ridge Racer 5 then comes up next for me because so that was the first PlayStation 2 game, just like Ridge Racer was the first PlayStation game. And it's notorious for the way they handle the field rendering does cause some jaggies, as it was called at the time. But I don't think it's actually a serious problem today. And if you look beyond that, everything else going on there is just superb. I really feel like Namco showcased sort of what they could do with the hardware right away. Specifically, there's a lot to do with you have the much more detailed car models throughout. They do a lot with lighting, like the blooming of the sun. Like as you pass through the trees and the sun's in the distance, you sort of see that huge full screen glow from it. They even simulate sort of the specular highlights on the road to a degree, or they try, not exactly, because the PlayStation 2 can't really do that, but that's something they would push going forward as well. But it's just, and there's depth of field effects in there and the replay. It's just, and it's the color scheme. You guys know what I mean. You look at the color scheme that they chose there, and whether you're midday, dusk, at night, there's something that still feels really I don't know, it's just very appealing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if it's something just kind of in my memory or if it's true or not, but I feel like there's a perception of that generation, the PS2 especially, for having kind of sort of dark and sort of underwhelming from a color standpoint visuals, but Ridge Racer 5, I mean, whether or not that's true is kind of anecdotal, I guess, but Ridge Racer 5 definitely doesn't look like it. It's a very, very pretty game, and yeah, I was never really bothered by the jaggies that much.
No, and I think on a CRT, even today, it actually looks really crisp and fine. It's really just, depending on your display. And people, this game caused so much confusion at the time because people didn't understand why jaggies were happening. And there's really two reasons. First of all, a lot of PS2 games did use field rendering where they were literally taking advantage of interlacing by rendering half frames per frame. So you'd have 224 lines per frame, and it's alternating the odd and even scan lines. But the other thing is that, you'd hear, oh, the Dreamcast has anti-aliasing or something like that. It didn't. It was literally just a flicker. It was a flicker filter for interlaced output. And the PS2 can absolutely do this, and a lot of games have this as well. It's really just a thing that, but on the PS2, programmers had to implement it, whereas on Dreamcast, it seems like it was pretty much an automatic thing. But I've kind of come around on that, and I actually don't like flicker filtering on a real CRT anymore. I prefer the super raw, like mega sharp pixels of the PS2. Like it just looks really like intense and super sharp in a way. So I really like the way this game looks.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I was actually watching your Ridge Racer 5 video recently, where you explain, a lot about the field rendering and all of that. You notice something weird with the textures on the car in this game? It's kind of like they're unfiltered.
Oh yeah, they're point sampled, exactly. And I think they did that to because you don't usually get the camera right up close to the cars. And I think they decided at launch there that it was better to not apply texture filtering to it, just to keep it kind of sharper. I'd be curious to see what it looked like with texture filtering enabled, but yeah, I think it was just a design decision. They just opted not to filter those textures on the cars specifically.
Now, what's interesting is that when you look at, we can move the topic along to this game or not right now and continue to talk about Ridge Racer 5 for a bit. But when you look at Ridge Racers on the PSP, it has they kind of have those textures on the cars at a lower resolution, but they filter them to hell, so they look pixelated but also extremely blurry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I mean, we can move on to Ridge Racers because I feel like that was the next big step. I in some ways, I think Ridge Racers on PSP is one of the most impressive launch games ever.
Absolutely.
I think up there with the achievement of something like Super Mario 64. Seeing the fact that Ridge Racers today, you load that up on a PSP right now, it's still an attractive game.
Yep.
It looks good. It's very, very smooth. So this was the first time we'd ever seen anything like this, where you have basically near PS2 and in some ways beyond PS2 graphics running at a full 60 frames per second on a portable system like this. Some of the things that they did that really impressed me was they actually did find a way to simulate specular highlights on the road surface. So do you guys know what that means when I say that?
The way the light kind of shines when it hits an object, or
if you have if you have the sun on the horizon and you're driving into the road, you actually see the glow of the sun sort of sparkling off the road surface.
Yep.
Typically, with Xbox and going forward and now, you would just do that with a pixel shader. Obviously, this kind of hardware didn't really have that, though the PSP has some interesting functions. And they were kind of able to simulate that to a degree. And they also have full, they're probe reflections, I guess, are capturing the environment and mapping it to the car, kind of I guess, Gran Turismo 3, really. Whereas Ridge Racer 5 just used these sort of repeating reflection textures that vary depending on whether you were in a tunnel or not, whereas on PSP the reflections actually correspond to the environment, which is really absurd for that. And so just seeing all of this running at 60 FPS, I mean, obviously the geometry and texture quality is slightly reduced over what we'd seen in the past, obviously due to those limitations, but on that small screen, from a normal gameplay view, I don't think it's that noticeable.
I think it gets kind of overlooked how unbelievable it was to see a game like this on the portable system in 2005, coming off the Game Boy Advance, going from that to Ridge Racer on the PSP. I mean, even if you compare it to Ridge Racer 64 or Ridge Racer DS, which was Ridge Racer 64 on the DS, it's night and day. It really has better. Aged. It's aged so well. It was so impressive at the time. I remember when I got my PSP, and obviously I was pretty young at the time, I would just alternate between that and Wipeout Pure, which was also, very impressive.
Yeah. It's a shame that this kind of feat was not recreated on the Vita. The Ridge Racer game there obviously is very light on content, but also, reduced frame rate. It's only 30 frames per second. It's just it's really a shame that it turned out that way, because Ridge Racers on PSP, just amazing. And also, there's the sequel, which is kind of more Ridge Racers.
Yep.
But it's kind of the ultimate Ridge Racers because it has so much content. I mean, it's just absurd how many tracks and events are packed in that thing. It's so good.
Ridge Racers 2 has got every single PlayStation 1 era Ridge Racer track, and the obviously very large selection of cars. And as far as the cars are concerned, what distinguishes it from the first one is that it has the original Angel and Devil car,
Yep.
or at least the ones I think that were in Ridge Racer 5. So yeah, it is like a best of. The shame about that one was that Ridge Racers 2 did not come out in North America. So I actually wasn't able to play the game until I recently jailbroke my Vita and was able to get it up and running on there. And
I
it's been great.
imported that from Japan at the time. I'd just come back from living there, and I was like, oh, you know what? Ridge Racers is coming out. Ridge Racers 2, so I got that immediately. And then I find out later after moving to Europe that, oh, it came out here as well. It's like it's just the USA that didn't get it for some reason.
Yeah, it's so strange.
It is so similar to the first game, except for those extra content additions that I kind of get it,
I
but
kind
it's
of see.
disappointing.
But you go back to like, you know, Ridge Racer Revolution and Ridge Racer and that kind of stuff, and you think like,
Yeah.
I mean, come on. They've done this before.
Yeah, I think as a series, like, Ridge Racer is kind of strange like that. There is obviously numbered sequels and kind of big leaps, but for every one of those, there's also, like, those kind of bit part titles, because, like we touched on, when you see this game compared to Ridge Racer DS, it was just, like, it underlined the huge power differential between the consoles and set the PSP up nicely to kind of leverage that beyond.
And I guess, you know, to be fair to that, though, Ridge Racer DS and 64, I mean, that was developed by NST, I think, in the US, so
the DigiPen, I think, was but they're not really ever kind of credited as DigiPen in the game. At least I don't think so. Although there is a car that is called DigiPen Racing, which is
there you go.
cute.
So, but yes, you're right. It was developed in the US then.
Yeah,
by kind of a different team. And you can tell, I actually think they did all right, all things considered, but it doesn't feel authentic to Ridge Racer at the time.
We have a fan in the Time Extend Discord who absolutely loves that game. Shout out QXC, and he's adamant that it's like the best handling Ridge Racer game. He's not. I mean, it handles really well compared to those early games, and you have the benefit of the analog stick on the N64. It just doesn't. You know, from a style standpoint, it just doesn't kind of reach the heights of the other games.
Still, honestly, that's actually the PSP Ridge Racer, I think it handles great for a portable game, but it is a little bit simplified. I still think that the series never got better than Ridge Racer 5's handling. Like, to me, that is like the perfect handling. It just feels fantastic to control, and it requires just enough skill where, you know, and finesse that really kind of pushes you to get better and keep playing.
It's such a solid handling title, and yeah, I mean, I would, if there was ever to be a new Ridge Racer game, I would love for them to go back to that. But
big time.
Yeah.
I guess with that said, the last one to really talk about is Ridge Racer 7, right?
Yeah, and you know, technically this is actually almost like a Ridge Racers 2 situation, where Ridge Racer 7 is kind of derived from Ridge Racer 6 on Xbox 360, and I like both of these games, but 7 kind of bucks the trend of what was happening around the PS3 launch, where PS3 games typically kind of looked and ran worse than Xbox 360 games, despite the system being touted as more powerful at the time.
Yep.
Whereas Ridge Racer 7 actually comes along, and Namco delivered, they were one of the only developers to deliver a full 1080p at 60 frames per second output for this game, like native 1080p. For 2006, this was just kind of absurd, and you know, most people didn't have a 1080p TV at that point. I mean, that's so. It's not like pushing the tech, but you look back at that generation now, and I actually think Ridge Racer 7's aesthetic kind of holds up better than a lot of PS3 games. They didn't go crazy with all like the normal maps and various modern lighting techniques and shadow maps, which all of those systems could do, but they couldn't do it well enough to make it like performant and super attractive. So Ridge Racer 7 kind of takes a more old style approach to visual rendering, but it does so at a really high fidelity and frame rate, and it's just it really holds up nicely.
I do like the subtle, the one effect I remember from that game is that when you hit the nitrous, there's a nice little kind of color banding that kind of pops into the screen. That always
Yeah.
looked really good to me.
The RGB separation kind of effect.
Yeah. It's a very
Also,
pretty
they added
game.
those reflections in the caves. If you remember that.
Yeah, I remember
When you-
that.
I remember being very impressed by the textures on the trees and the caves on, I think, Mist Falls is a track, but a lot of that is being able to play the game. Like, yeah, it's a shame that, considering at this time people probably had 720p TVs, or maybe they hadn't even upgraded to HD TVs yet, so you really only got to see the full brunt of what that game was doing once you had a better full HD TV in the future.
It was also interesting because they did everything in 1080p. The full interface is all 1080p, so super crisp fonts everywhere, and you could even install the game to the hard drive to like massively reduce loading times. Not that they were bad from the disc anyway, but you could make them very, very short. I think my only complaint, and the one thing that sticks out with me all these years later, is that for whatever reason, the car engine noises in Ridge Racer 7, to me it always sounds like a lawnmower going around the track. And I've never been able to not hear that. It's the one thing that drives me nuts.
Like Gran Turismo problem.
But even more so, dude. It's like
Yeah.
it's this like whining noise compared to, like, you know, even Ridge Racer 6. I really don't know why. the
Well,
engine noises
especially
are what they are.
because, you know, in Ridge Racer 6 and 7, you're always going at full speed, right? You're always bouncing off
Yes.
that rev limiter, so you're going to hear that a lot. You don't get a break.
Exactly. It's not like a racing sim where you're rowing the gears and you're actually using the full power of the car. Here you're just like always full out. Yeah.
Yeah, the cool thing about Ridge Racer 7 too is the servers are still up. So as of, like, I don't know. I mean, I probably haven't done this in almost a year, but I remember at the beginning of the pandemic with a friend, we were just playing Ridge Racer 7. We were the only people online, but it was great. I mean, I'm just amazed that you can still play that game online today.
That's super cool. I love that.
That game as well, on the online lobbies, I'm sure it had like auto-translating, like quick chat commands, if I remember right, because it was
Yes,
like you could
yes.
talk to people, like, obviously with the preset sentences, but it was always so cool seeing, like, whatever flag, if it was somebody from Japan or something, and you could have like a kind of a back and forth conversation as much as Namco would allow, like, great race, you too.
It also had that kind of like news ticker kind of approach, right? Where you'd always be seeing like new high scores and everything kind of appearing along the ticker to kind of keep you playing. It was really interesting, like that faux internet kind of aesthetic.
Yeah.
Where like, oh, you're surrounded by info.
Yeah, they used that to amazing effect in that game, because when it wasn't showing online, like, latest times and stuff like that, it would present sort of contextual, you know, Ridge Racer lore on the ticker.
Oh, yeah.
There. You'd see, like, RT Silvaloo boss Enki Gilbert had this to say, and it's just like, how many people in the world are going to care? But I love that. Like, as a Ridge Racer nerd, it's so cool that they put that much effort into it.
Oh, I love that Namco of that era. It's so
Yeah.
good.
So Ridge Racer alone took up a good half hour this episode.
As it should, you know.
That's true.
And with that, I guess it's time to move on. So we have a couple other games that we want to bring up. The one that kind of came to my mind right away was actually the Sega Rally port on the Saturn. And the reason for that is, you look at it, if you have a still image of the Model 2 original and you have a still image of the Saturn port and you put them next to each other, you probably would think, like, what's the big deal, right? Because just in the still image, there was a reduction clearly of polygons. Everything's not quite as sharp, and it does look cut down for a Saturn game. But compare this to everything else at the time, and, like, to me, this is one of the most impressive arcade conversions ever. I mean, we were just talking about the original Ridge Racer, which is very impressive from a technical standpoint, but whereas I feel like I couldn't control the cars as well on the PlayStation with that controller as in the arcade version, I really do think that the Saturn port of Sega Rally not only looks like it should and runs like it should, but just plays. The handling is still sublime. And Brendan, I know that you still consider this, like maybe your favorite racing game just in terms of feel, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that stretches across the arcade cab and the Saturn port. Like, even going back now, whenever I've had the chance to play on a cab, it's been fantastic. But playing the Saturn version just maintains that experience incredibly well. And to be honest, the Saturn has no right to be kind of going toe to toe with an arcade board at the time that was so advanced. And it's an impressive experience all around, because it isn't like they identified one area to kind of cut down on and limit heavily, but rather just kind of, it seemed like it was spread evenly across the full experience, so that if you've never played the arcade version, you would never know that that's what it's based on, because it just feels like a great experience on the Saturn itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. So this was one of the Saturn games I got. So I got into Saturn, I think it was like late 97, 98 early, because I had a little stint where I was mostly into the PC, and I heard about, Sega's Next system, so I was like, I better get into the Saturn now. So I started buying tons of games for the Saturn around then, when it was cheaper. And Sega Rally Championship was one of the first I got, because I loved playing in the arcade. And yeah, I was super impressed with it, because I actually think this is one of the finest ports of that era. Because, like you say, they did such an exceptional job of sort of capturing the artistic design of the arcade. Like, the colors, the textures, like the track design, everything feels basically spot on. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it looks like, if one of my favorite things is, if you let the game play the attract mode, like, it lines up so well with that arcade game.
Yep.
Like, if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit, you could almost like mistake them for one another, if not for the frame rate, of course. And it's just, it's such a step up. It feels like such a step up from Daytona USA, which, again, Daytona would have been a very challenging game to port, just due to the nature of all those cars that can appear on screen. But Sega Rally, though, it's just, gosh, and it looks and handles so well. Like, it really does feel like as close as you could imagine to like a proper arcade conversion at home.
Yeah, it's so good that, like, honestly, I didn't really miss not having, I mean, so at least in the US, I hear a lot from people in the UK that Sega Rally is very common over there. It was never common where I grew up on the East Coast. It was always Daytona. So I never really had much of an opportunity to play the Model 2 original, but this arcade port was so good that I didn't really care. The frame rate is half, and that it is what it is, but just having a consistent 30, which is, what this game ran on, especially coming off Daytona, like you were saying, it's really all you needed, just having that consistency. And Sega Rally, obviously, as one of those classic Sega arcade racers, is a game that rewards that sort of consistency. So you can just get dialed in, and combined with the physics, it was perfect.
Yeah, I think this actually might be the Ridge Racer equivalent, or even more so. Yeah. Where if you actually even just look at like the track geometry and like the placement of the trees, everything like that, like it's almost 1-to-1. which is genuinely shocking to see considering just how much more powerful the Model 1 board is, or Model 2 board is, compared to Sega Saturn. But they really managed to cram everything in there and just sort of strategically cut down in areas where it makes sense. Of course, the cars are slightly less detailed. The opponent cars are like flat shaded mostly, with just using colors instead of like textures and things like that. But like overall, it's so close, and I think Brendan's right about the handling. Like it's almost so good that I could almost say I prefer playing it on the Saturn versus the arcade game. In some ways, like I love playing on the machine. The D-pad, like exactly, like how the heck are the D-pad controls just so? It just feels great. Like it's really, really nice.
And they were very concerned about that too. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, you're absolutely right. So I just think for the time, this is, it's one of those things where like you can look at it now and kind of appreciate it, but I feel like if you were there at the time and you actually experienced it, especially, I was lucky enough to have Sega Rally, Daytona, and Virtua Racing arcade machines all at a local arcade, and then eventually Daytona 2. We had a huge arcade for this stuff.
The dream.
So, seeing this on the Saturn, and even by the time I had the Saturn, I already had a PC with a 3DFX graphics card in it as well. And even against that, I still felt like, wow, okay, this is really good. Though it is interesting, did you guys ever play the PS2 port of Sega Rally?
Yes.
Yes, yep.
That's also quite good. I think that's M2 that did that, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I was never familiar with who was responsible for that. I mean, that is pretty much the arcade ROM, so much so that you could, I saw somebody say that you could actually access a test menu or something.
That's very possible. There's a bunch of display modes and different options in there as well. And I think it's M2 based on the menu system, and if I remember, I can't remember 100%, but I think it was an M2 port. And yeah, that one is pretty much arcade perfect. Since it's probably just the arcade game adapted to the PS2, but this is still more impressive, and I actually think it's worth very briefly touching on the crushing disappointment that was Sega Rally Championship 2 on Dreamcast, because to me that was such a letdown in a way that I couldn't believe what had happened there, because I first saw Virtua Fighter 3 TB running on Dreamcast. It was the first Dreamcast game I ever saw in person. It was a Japanese imported unit. And at the time, I hadn't done a side-by-side and learned that there were actually some visual differences. Yeah. But, just playing it there, it was like, wow, they actually have a Model 3 arcade game running, like, perfectly on the Dreamcast, which is absurd. But then you play Sega Rally, and the frame rate's just terrible. And I think that's just down to them relying on the Windows CE libraries instead of the internal Sega APIs. And so Windows CE would prove to not be quite performant enough on Dreamcast. And I think that ultimately kind of just killed that conversion, which is a shame.
Oh, sorry, Brendan.
No, I was just going to say, like, when I revisited Sega Rally 2 on the Dreamcast not so long ago, I was like, I must have somehow blocked it out of memory, but I was absolutely stunned at how poor it runs, purely because, I mean, it's a fantastic game still, like, as a whole, but it really becomes difficult to put up with it, especially in the more challenging stages in the game.
The frame drops happen in such random places too. Like I think it's probably, was it Muddy or like whatever one of the first tracks in the arcade mode is, or in the 10-year championship mode. Like the second to last corner you come around, it doesn't matter whether there's another car on screen or not. You will always lose like half your frame rate right in that corner. So much so that when I went to play I was able to emulate the Model 3 version via Supermodel, which is a great way to play that game.
Oh yeah.
And I was so confused when I went through that corner and the game was still 60 FPS. I was like, what's going on? I'm not used to this.
See, that was actually probably the biggest mistake they made, is like the variable frame rate. Basically, they're just rendering as fast as they can, but they use a double buffer VSync setup. So if it can't hit 60, if it misses that render time, it just drops to 30. And so you just constantly going up and down. And I think that there is the code to lock it to 30, and then there's also the code, it's considered the high frame rate code, but it was basically just removing detail. And you'd still get slowed down, just less of it. But I think if they had just said, you know what, we're just going to cap this at 30 from the beginning, it may have been better received. Like, the disappointment of not being 60 is there, but it should just be like this consistent. It's better to have a consistent 30 than these constant teases where you're like, oh, I get this stretch of 60, and then you go around the corner and now it's 30, and that just feels awful.
Yeah, it can make you feel a bit seasick.
This is actually something that I wasn't expecting to talk about Sega Rally 2, but I'm glad we are. And I'd like to ask you this, John, because there's always, I feel like I see this a lot with reference to the Dreamcast and those Model 3 ports.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a perception based on how Virtua Fighter 3 kind of diminished some things, but still looked okay for the time. And then Sega Rally 2 obviously had its frame rate issues. There's sort of this perception that the Dreamcast couldn't handle Model 3. Do you think it was a power thing, or do you think it was just like not enough time? The system obviously didn't have very long to mature. I feel like you could have gotten better ports than we did.
And you did. Virtual on Oratorio Tangram looks better than the arcade game, and that's also Model 3. I just think it's a matter of time and using the right APIs. 'Cause, I mean, again, VF3 was done by Genki, I think, so it wasn't even Sega itself, and it was done for launch in 1998. So doing a launch title at all, that's brutal. So I can see why things would be cut there. And then, of course, Sega Rally 2, just being that it was based on Windows CE, a bad decision there. But I think the Dreamcast could handle pretty much any Model 3 conversion if done right. But that's the key. It's not a trivial thing. It's going to require some hard work, no doubt, because the systems are comparable. And also, it's worth noting that Model 3 games run at a slightly lower resolution than Dreamcast does. Like, Dreamcast outputs 640 by 480 pretty much. And I think Model 3 was like 384 some P. I can't actually remember the exact number, but it was higher res than most arcade games at the time, but it was still lower res than what the Dreamcast did. So the Dreamcast not only had to duplicate the visuals, but it had to do it at a higher resolution. So that also would no doubt place a strain on the resources.
Yeah. I will always go back to that tech demo of Scud Race running on the Dreamcast that is on YouTube in, like, awful 240p resolution or something like that, and just cry about what could have been.
Man, my boss was actually at all of those Dreamcast like reveal things in Japan.
Oh man.
And seeing all that, I'm envious. I wish he'd gotten some footage of it at the time, because there's not enough good footage of all this stuff.
I have found myself, the old assembler forum, which I don't think is up anymore, but there were people on there who, and I don't know how much of it is actually real or not, but there were a couple folks who were saying, like, who had all this background information about, like, what was really going on and how they were trying to port Scud Race and everything. And it's like, it's so hard to verify, or basically impossible at this point, but I just get carried away with the thoughts of it, because God, Scud Race for me, and I think a lot of people listening and Sega arcade fans would agree, Scud Race and Daytona 2 were the holy grail that we never got.
Yeah.
Also, Virtua Fighter 3 on the Saturn.
Yeah.
Which was not really a thing, I don't think. Although, I even asked Yu Suzuki himself about that. But of course, he's either just forgotten, which is what he said, or it's just like, we're not talking about that. But it does kind of get the impression that people that maybe experimented with that, if it was a thing, just they don't remember, don't care that much.
Yeah, there was probably lots of
shame.
Experimentation things going on.
I think that's actually key, especially when a new platform hits. Like, the programmers there, they're probably doing everything they can just to play around with it, learn the system. And Sega itself, engineering the box, is obviously going to be running a lot of tests and test scenarios. So I could see this having happened in the back.
Yeah. So I could keep talking about those Sega games all day.
Oh yeah.
But So let's move on to John. I don't know how much time you have, or if we're
I'm fine on time.
great, awesome, love to hear it. Let's move on to one that I think, to me, this is one of the most difficult for me to unpack from a technical standpoint, and what I know, or rather don't know. And you can definitely offer a lot on this, I feel. And that is a game that we've never really talked about in Time Extend, but we really should, because it's very interesting. World Driver Championship on the N64.
Oh, yeah.
And so this came to us from Boss Game Studios, which was one of those N64 developers on the N64 that really kind of pushed the system early on. If you look at Top Gear Rally, which I don't think is a particularly fantastic game, but like at the time, visually, I mean, that was the game that people were comparing against Sega Rally on the Saturn side, and everyone was floored by, look at the car damage, which was really like, you could end up with some really weird looking cars when you crash them in that game. But that there were pretty big tracks, and they didn't really have any sort of like, the invisible walls and everything were kind of hard to find, these big environments and this really interesting kind of approach to physics, even if the game was a little buggy. And then you move on to this at the end of the N64's lifespan, World Driver Championship, and they employed these technical tricks that no other game on the N64 was doing at the time. And that just kind of floors me. But before I get into that, John, you were saying you're actually familiar with this one and the people who were behind it.
So yeah, from what I can tell and what I remember, I believe Ezra Driesbach actually worked at Boss Game Studio on this. Now I can't, my memory's a little fuzzy on this, but he was the guy, obviously, that did the work on Power Slave, Duke Nukem 3D, and Quake for the Sega Saturn. And then he would do stuff like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance and everything on the PlayStation 2. And I think in the interim, one of the games he worked on, I know he did like a Top Gear game as well, but I think he worked on this one as well, was this one, World Driver Championship. Because it's top tier in terms of what it's delivering tech-wise for the system, I think. Specifically, it's just, I mean, you guys kind of agree, it has a unique color palette and visual design that you really didn't see on the N64 that often. And sort of, it looks more like a PlayStation game, but in the best way.
Yep.
While taking advantage of N64's like hardware features, I guess. So like, it's all about lighting. Like she has like beautiful sort of like more ambient lighting, richly detailed polygons, great texture work that's higher res than usual, and everything runs mostly at a smooth 30 FPS. And it even has a nice high res mode, which runs in like ultra letterbox. But
even
it's
if you
very,
don't
very
have
sharp.
the expansion pack, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting decision to go to that small letterbox format, because obviously you're rendering less out to the screen that way, so you kind of improve your performance budget there. But when you do it, it looks so sharp for that system. It's really kind of absurd to see. And if you play it in first-person point of view, it really, really works well, I think.
Yeah, I often see this and what was it, that Indiana Jones game?
All from Factor 5.
Yeah, kind of hailed as like the examples of the N64 being pushed to a place that people really didn't think it could go. Because you look at World Driver Championship, and to me anyway, this was billed as, the N64's answer to Gran Turismo, which, like, in terms of content, it really isn't. But
No.
In terms of, the car handling is pretty good, and visually it's very impressive. It's better looking than Gran Turismo in terms of, like, it's not as pixelated, runs a little bit more smoothly. And actually, I think, like, in some ways, this game sort of visually, to me anyway, outperforms some of like the worst looking stuff on the Dreamcast. Like, it looks really good and does not resemble, I think, anything. Like, when I think about the N64, Yeah, I think about, low draw distances and anti-aliasing that just makes everything blurry. And, I think about the worst examples. Like World Driver Championship sort of bucks those trends. And it came out at the end, so it makes sense.
I think part of the thing there is that so a lot of N64 games, they would just, due to the low texture cache, a small texture cache, you'd often see sort of these super low res textures stretched out across the environment with like a very obvious repeating pattern. So a lot of racing games had this going on as well, where I think one of the most shocking things for me was when I loaded up, when I was talking about Road Rash recently, and I loaded up Road Rash on N64, and it's just smeared and just like 2 or 3 textures at most, just like smeared across the environment. There's nothing going on in the environment, and there was a lot of games in the system like this where World Driver Championship actually presents tracks that feel, like you say, like it almost looks like something that would be on Dreamcast. There's more variety, there's more texture variety, the textures are higher quality, there's lots of foliage and like trees that actually hold up pretty well. You're driving through like cities at night with like a bunch of unique buildings. It's really just the variety and the fidelity of all those objects in the environment and the way it all comes together with their lighting model that really makes it kind of stand out. And it looks unlike most games in the 64.
So, so are you familiar with how they were kind of able to achieve this? Because I was doing research and basically, and you could, I'm going to say some things here and you could correct me if I say anything that's wrong, but so Boss Game Studios kind of developed their own sort of replacement for the Z buffer on the N64, from what I understand. They had this microcode that was called Z sort, and it's actually a reason why for a very long time, actually up until 2019, you really couldn't emulate this game because none of the emulators, I guess they really couldn't reverse engineer or understand how Z-sort worked. But by sort of foregoing the Z buffer, not using that aspect of the N64, not using the tools that were there, they were able to greatly free up resources, which is just, crazy to me. I mean, look, obviously I'm not a developer, I'm not a programmer, I don't have a deep understanding of how these things work, but just that they were able to get so much performance out of the system by not using what everyone else was using is very interesting.
I think that's one of the secrets to the N64, and this is something Factor 5 also tended to do. There's a lot of like libraries and opcodes and other things that are just standard with the N64 development kit. And I think most games are developed around this, just using that stuff. And I don't know for sure, but from what I can gather, it seems like this was the Nintendo preferred way to do things. Almost like they just, that was like the default way. Mm-hmm. But some developers like Boss, obviously, they did a lot of their own libraries and different tricks specifically that they developed for the system to allow it to use the hardware in a slightly different way. And I think that's why they're able to achieve these results, is they didn't just stick with the default stuff. They actually went in and coded their own, which difficult. And yeah, it really kind of shows in the few games that really did it that way. You can really tell that they pushed it pretty hard. Yeah.
Brendan, I know you've been quiet, but I also know you didn't really have an N64 growing up, so...
Yeah, it's one of the kind of dark spots in my kind of gaming history, really, because I was properly on that kind of PlayStation hype train at the time, and as far as Nintendo was concerned, it was kind of strictly portables, which we'll probably come into a bit later. But yeah, it's one of those ones where when I look at footage of this one, even just on YouTube and stuff, obviously not the ideal way of viewing it, but you can just see far and away, especially for me, like the smoothness in the gameplay seems particularly impressive for the console. I just don't want to kind of make any passing statements about the game that might not be entirely true, since I'm basing it off of kind of highly compressed video, but definitely just in terms of the history as well of this game, it was interesting for me to look up as well, because apparently Boss Studios nearly ended up working with Xbox on a game that never
And we covered that in our unreleased Racers episode. Basically, they there was this game called Racer X, and you can actually find footage of it online. And listen to that episode if you want to hear more about it. But from what I remember, Boss was actually working very closely with Microsoft in the lead up to the Xbox's launch, and they had pretty much finished this game. And the physics were kind of a draw upon what they achieved with World Driver Championship, which had been an improvement on Top Gear Rally and whatever came before that. And they had a lot of... they were proud of what they were able to do technically. Like, I remember reading something about the falling leaves or something on the track, accumulating on the track. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, I think Microsoft was supposed to publish the game and didn't. They were looking for a publisher, couldn't find one, and the studio folded, which is really sad because, as we've discussed, they were going places that few were at the time.
Yeah. And I love that name too, Racer X. That's so perfect for the Xbox.
I don't know if that's what they would have ultimately called the final version of the game, but you'd think it would have been at least would have been a good compliment to PGR, which was obviously a fantastic launch title, but
or Apex, if you remember that.
Yes, Apex, Racing Evolution. Weird game.
Or was it like
Evoluzione?
Or something like that?
Yeah.
I was looking up just some video footage of Racer X there, and obviously a YouTube comment take with a grain of salt, but I found a comment supposedly from the lead programmer on the game, and the guys went into like 5 separate paragraphs about the development. I can share that, guys, with you after the pod, but it does say about the name. It would have been a lousy name, that was just a code name. Some of us considered it a World Driver Championship 2, but that would have meant a trademark conflict with Midway, so that never happened. And that's just among a few things that this person says.
I totally forgot that Midway published WDC. That's weird.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, actually. I can see how you would have missed this, though, being in the UK, because the N64 situation in Europe is pretty dire, I feel.
Yeah, definitely.
Where it's like composite video only, everything's 25 hertz. There's really no easy way to do a region mod on anything because of the way the lockout works. So it's like you either PAL or NTSC with N64, and there's really no getting around that, so...
the joys of being in the PAL region. I'm amazed to this day, like a game like Sonic managed to take off. Going way back just purely based on how like hindered it was by that refresh rate and stuff.
Slow and bordered.
Exactly. Whenever I got to play the proper version of that game, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how it's supposed to actually play.
I feel like the PlayStation Classic, the PlayStation Classic had a lot of issues, but that was... You really take, growing up in North America, you really take NTSC or Japan or Asia, you really take NTSC for granted. And playing some of those PAL games on the PlayStation Classic, I was like, wow.
Well, to be fair though, with that it was more that they were converting 50 to 60 hertz, so it looked really jerky.
Okay.
Whereas if you actually see 50 hertz on a CRT, it basically looks the same as 60 hertz. It's a little flickery, but it has the same level of fluidity.
Gotcha.
Visually, it's just the games themselves weren't designed around it, so yeah, they were often slow and bordered, and it was especially bad on the Mega Drive because you'd have like the color border around it, because that was one of the main palettes they'd be pulling from, like Palette Zero or something. So you just have this huge colored area around the game, and then you have like a postage stamp squished down image of the game itself.
I think we know why Sega didn't go with blast processing over here for their advertising then.
Love those Mega Drive postage stamps. Yeah, so WDC is an interesting one, and I think the last one, you had actually brought this up, Brendan. This is a game I have never played. Is the Game Boy Advance port of V-Rally 3, which came out actually pretty early in 2002. I didn't know that. I'm looking at this now, and it's very, very impressive given how early this came out in the GBA's life.
Yeah, exactly. Like this was one that I felt was worth bringing up purely because we've talked about how getting the most out of a console can really show off a really kind of impressive technical showcase, and I feel as if on the GBA, the 3D experiences were so few and far between, but the racing genre definitely seen quite a lot of them. And in V-Rally's implementation, it's not only impressive to look at even now, just with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what that console was capable of, but also from the perspective of actually offering a very smooth and fun rally experience. And I mean, there was no shortage of them on the GBA, to be honest, but V-Rally 3, this is like my favourite version of that game, purely because when I was playing through this as well, I had the GBA Micro, and just like the high quality screen, and obviously the screen size being smaller than the original GBA, it just made it like such a incredible experience to look at visually for a console from that, for a game from that generation.
Yeah, it seems like they're just doing software rendered full 3D environments on the GBA here, and then they're using sprites for the cars, which actually looks pretty good, with a fair number of frames for each position. So as you turn left and right, the car kind of moves left and right smoothly. So it's really quite convincing, and I guess on that small screen, the visual artifacts of like the texture swimming would be a lot less visible.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's smooth. It's surprisingly smooth, I'd say.
There's even a dash cam as well.
There is a cockpit view. It's a texture, but it's more than you got in most games. You didn't have cockpit views in console-based racing games at the time for the most part, and you have one on the GBA. It's crazy.
That is cool, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so weird, though, that the ambitions of trying to do 3D in the GBA. And the fact is, like, most attempts actually don't really hold up well. Like, they're just kind of choppy and ugly and don't play nicely. Like, the 2D games are where it's at. But this is true. This is one of the few where it's fast and smooth enough where it actually still feels good to play. Like, it's quite nice. And that's... I think I mentioned it to you guys earlier, but it's kind of like a history with V-Rally on portable. Like if you go back to the original V-Rally on the Game Boy, the black and white Game Boy, that's also a super smooth, like 3D perspective kind of racing game on that thing from 1989. And it's great. So this series kind of has a nice pedigree of delivering really smooth pseudo 3D or 3D games on a portable system.
I would like to give a shout out to on YouTube. There's someone, the account is named Minimi. They did a whole video, a 35-minute video on the history of 3D graphics on the Game Boy Advance.
Oh.
That goes into not just V-Rally 3, but pretty much every 3D engine, which is very relevant to Time Extend because a lot of them were for racing games. More, I would say it seems like, at least maybe like 50% of them were racing games. And you have a lot of examples in there I'd forgotten about. I think it is really impressive to look at what the V3 Dev, which was the developer for this, with Fernando Velez and Guillaume Dubail, what they were able to achieve, because you look at, like, for example, the Sega Rally game on GBA, which is ambitious, but really hard to look at.
So this actually gets into like a complaint of mine with so I feel like in some ways racing games try to go polygonal too fast, or like they got rid of some old techniques too quickly. So it applies on the GBA, it applies on systems like the Atari Jaguar as well, where it's like, okay, these systems aren't really that good at generating polygons for games, right? Like this turned out okay, but Superscaler, Sega style Superscaler games, like I feel like those died too early. Like Absolutely. By the time we got to console hardware that could really deliver that, they just kind of disappeared. I mean, you've seen plenty of ports of stuff like Outrun, but Superscaler stuff went way further than that. And some of the last games, like you look at like Outrunners, or like there's that one Capcom game that I'm forgetting the name of.
Slipstream, I think the F1 one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the one. You see those, just it's all sprites, but it's so convincing and it's just so cool to see running. And I feel like it would have been great to see more games like that during that time. And I mentioned the Jaguar specifically because there's a game called Super Burnout on there that runs at smooth 60 FPS using Superscaler kind of sprite scaling techniques. It feels great. Every other 3D polygon game on the Jaguar runs at like 10 frames per second in comparison. But this is like 60, and it looks visually beautiful still. So
I didn't know about this.
Kind of lament the fact.
Huh.
Yeah, you guys should check it out.
Looking at it
It's
now.
great looking. It's like, man, they should have done more games like this.
This reminds
that
me kind
hardware.
of Riding Hero, the Neo Geo game.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, more advanced probably, but yeah, this is really pretty. They're racing on Laguna Seca, which is pretty funny. It's a real track.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you know, I wish we had seen more sprite scaling racing games. And I think GBA could have been an interesting place to do more of that, potentially. But it just kind of, you know, polygons kind of won the day. And there were a lot of great polygonal racers, you know, during the 32 and 64-bit era, of course. But, you know, it would have been cool to see more. And also some slightly better ports, like Power Drift got ported to the Saturn, for instance, and it's like arcade perfect visually, but it runs at half the frame rate.
That port is so expensive. I've wanted it for so long.
I'm positive though that it could run at 60, given the time. But even at 30 though, it's pretty smooth and awesome just to see that running on the Saturn. It looks great.
Power Drift is a gorgeous game. I also really love the original arcade version of Super Monaco GP. That game is very pretty.
Yeah.
It is amazing to me, especially when you look at like Super Monaco GP, how like they were able to approach something that looked so realistic, even though, you know, it was just a collection of scaled 2D texture sprites. You know, it really is amazing that they were able to sort of distill almost this like vintage photographic quality to the visuals in those games using the tech they had.
It's kind of weird though. I mean, the Saturn really is kind of doing that anyway. It's just with additional coordinates to create the illusion of 3D, basically using quads. But it's basically a bunch of distorted sprites in 3D Saturn games. So, you know.
Yeah, I think Gale Racer is interesting for that reason too, because
that's quite it. They changed that a lot from the arcade game it's based on.
They made the cars polygonal, I think.
And it looks worse for it, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think like the push towards polygonal was probably driven on portables as well, just to try and kind of emulate the home console experience as much as possible. I think looking back, like we're saying, more super scalar games and stuff would have been great, and I think nowadays as we see indie games especially try and replicate old styles that perhaps died off too quickly, such as Victory Heat Rally, which is going for this type of style. I think we will get some cool games with this type of tech now, but definitely I think it was maybe trying to run before you could walk type scenario, almost trying to fit in like a full 3D engine on the GBA. Perhaps it would have been better to just kind of opt more for this type of style of game.
I completely agree. I'm still sore about the lack of a home port of Outrunners that's actually like, you know, matches the arcade game.
Yeah. Well, there is now that Arcade 1-Up makes that miniature Outrun cabinet that does have the arcade version of Outrunners. So if you want to spend $500 and have the room for it, there's your Outrunners port. Well, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't really have much more to say about the game we were originally talking about because I haven't played it. But it looks good, Brendan. It looks great.
Yeah, exactly. It was
game.
more of a shout out than anything, just because I was impressed with.
It's a good one to throw in there.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean that's all I brought, and that's pretty much all I have to say. I don't want to end things right now unless we're all pretty satisfied. But I really enjoyed this conversation. This was great.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing with this kind of subject is you could go on and on and on, and there's so many examples of this, but you always run the risk of going too far, and sometimes it's better to save that for future discussions. But
we're gonna do a part 2.
Like
okay, I got you, John. Yep,
heard
you loud and clear.
But yeah, I think the series we talked about today, those specific games as well, are all really interesting examples of pushing the technology in a very positive way at the time. And a lot of those games I still love and still play regularly. And we didn't even touch on the fact that, especially with like Sega Rally port, you could play that in split screen,
Yes.
which was even wilder to think that the Saturn was doing that, playing a game like that in split screen mode, and it was smooth. Come on.
At a
It's
time
awesome.
when you had to link PlayStations together to play the early Ridge Racer games.
Exactly.
Overall, John, thank you so much for coming on the show. The expertise you lend is obviously indispensable, and hey, it's great to talk about old racing games with someone else who loves old racing games. So very much
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks for
that.
having me. I love talking old racing games, that's for sure.
And yeah, I mean that's Brent, you got anything more to say before we close this one out?
No, just obviously the same sentiment here. I mean, when it comes to discussing old racing games and you want to look at maybe a bit more of the tech behind it, I mean, you're kind of the de facto go-to for that, John. So, and we also knew that you would enjoy being able to talk about these games. So it's been great just recapping some elements. And one of the kind of common threads we often see is that we don't somehow talk about Ridge Racer enough, so hopefully everybody enjoyed that 40-minute or so addendum to the previous discussions we've had.
No matter how much we talk about Ridge
Racer.
Racer, it's never enough for these people. So
You can always talk about Ridge Racer. 'Cause we just want it to come back. That's all.
everybody wants it to come back. We had
To do it right.
we had Paul Ryczynski on the show, who developer of Drive Club and Project
Oh man,
Cars
Paul's
3
such
and Onrush.
what a nice dude.
He's fantastic. And we asked him, Paul, what racing game would you make if you could work on anything? And he was like, it's gotta be Ridge Racer. It's gotta be.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to see that.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.